I guess the first question to address is, who is this Peter character that we're talking about? And as per usual in the Bible, we don't get a ton of background information about this character, any character in the biblical story, just a few details. Peter was a fisherman from Capernaum, a small rural village where people fished on the Sea of Galilee, which is a misnomer because apparently, I've never been, it's more like a small lake. Who knew, right? Very few people were literate back in those days, and certainly not anyone from Capernaum. There were about 1,000 people who were living in it, they think, but no major infrastructure has been found, no agora, the market, and no synagogue, no paved roads, just a bunch of small houses. Fishing meant long hours for very little pay, often through the night. And then because the taxation was so high on those fisher people, they didn't get very much back from the work that they did do. So it was pretty thankless work. Peter is called from there. His name is Simon at the time. In the gospel that we're reading for today, it isn't the first time that he meets Jesus. There was another time, probably. But it is his call story, the place where he drops his nets and follows Jesus, ultimately becoming the rock. The rock. Just had to do that. Sorry. It might not be the only time. On which Jesus says that he will build his church. He is known as a person who started Christianity, although for some of you who might have listened to that Mary Magdalene sermon that I sent you, Mary Magdalene could challenge that title as the tower. Jesus names Simon the rock, but here's something that I found out. That's the way that it reads for us. But in the early manuscripts, written in Aramaic, the word that's used is actually rocky. And that's different, right? Building anything on rocky ground is different than building on a rock. It turns into rock when it gets translated into Greek. Petra. But maybe there's some wisdom in the ways that name evolves. Because as we're going to see as we wander with Peter through this Lenten series, Peter is rocky in his faith, in his leadership, and in his understanding. He will be the first who will declare that Jesus is Messiah. But he will also be the one who says things that make Jesus say, "Do you still not understand?" He will be the one who stands on water, but then freaks out and falls. He will say things so opposed to the dream of God that Jesus calls him Satan. He will be the one who denies Jesus 3 times as Jesus dies. But then after Jesus dies, he will become the one to stand before crowds and speak so powerfully and profoundly that he brings thousands of others along with him, according to the book of Acts. And maybe in Peter's wandering hearts, we can also find ourselves. Now let's look at that story for today. They're out fishing. They've been out all night, and they haven't caught much. We see these guys standing on the side of the shore, Simon and his brother, near the shores cleaning their nets, which is probably like the worst part of the job. Jesus is there teaching, and the crowds are pressing in on him. This part makes me really uncomfortable because those of you who know me know I probably like a pretty big bubble around me. And so when this kind of scene comes up, I often think of the Monty Python Life of Brian. You guys just watched that, right? Anyone else seen it? There's a bunch of people who decide that this guy named Brian is the Messiah, and they decide to follow him. And there's like crowds of people who just go wherever he is, and he's trying to hide out from them all the time. And there's this very funny scene that I used to watch with my friends every Easter. I wasn't going to say this part, but it's so funny, I'm going to do it anyway. He's like hiding in his mom's apartment, and then there's this whole crowd of people that are in the courtyard, and they're all, his mom's like, they want you to talk. You need to say something to them. And he doesn't want to talk to them. He sticks his head out the window. I can't remember everything that he says, but he says things like, I am not the Messiah. And everybody responds, yes, you are not the Messiah. And then, you all need to go home. Yes, we all need to go home, they all say. And then he says to them, you are all individuals. And they all say, yes, we are all individuals. And then one guy says, I'm not. You got to check it out. You need to be in the right mood for Monty Python for sure, but that's a pretty funny scene in it. So large crowds of people are showing up on the shore to hear what Jesus has to say. So many people that he's like being pushed out into the water, and so decides to jump into Peter's boat. And they're cleaning their nets. And he asks Peter to just row a little ways out, and from there he sits down in the boat and he teaches the people. I can just imagine the relief of not having those crowds pressing in on you. But that's probably just me. So, although I have a feeling I'm not the only one in this church that has a kind of big personal bubble. Yeah? Okay. It's all right. If it is just me, it's okay, because that's my quirkiness, right? Then Jesus sits down. All right, so he's speaking for a while, and then he turns to Peter, and he tells him to go out into those deeper waters and put down his nets. And Peter, he's trying to be respectful here. This is a teacher, someone who's probably smarter than him. And he says, we've worked all night and we have caught nothing. But if you say so, we will do what you ask and go out into the deeper waters and let down these clean nets again. And then they catch so many fish that they have to motion to another boat to get them to come out too, because there is so many fish and it fills these two boats. This really freaks Peter out, which is, makes sense. This is a sign for him that Jesus is at the very least magical and miraculous. Probably doesn't have a name for that yet. Who knows the emotions or thought behind his response? But he asks Jesus to go away from him because he's a sinful man. Of course, if Jesus wanted to find a not sinful man, or 12 of them, he'd be waiting for a very, very long time. Eternity. Jesus tells him, don't be afraid. From now on, you will be catching people. I imagine that Peter must have looked at those two boats overflowing with all those fish, and that beach overflowing with all those people. So crowded that Jesus had to get into a boat in order to have some space from them. Such overabundance that it was totally overwhelming, and not known what to make of what it would mean to go fishing for people. But I can tell you, later on in that book of Acts, when we get to that Pentecost story, Peter is the one who will stand up and explain the chaos that is going on around everyone, where everybody's speaking in different languages, and then talk about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And the scripture tells us that Peter's words pierced their hearts, and about 3,000 people were baptized and added to the church that day. But that's a few years away from this story that we have today by the lakeside. And as I said, Peter will make many missteps along the way. He starts out on rocky ground and grows into the rock on which God will build his church. And my guess is by the time we get to Acts, he's also still making some missteps, because there isn't a way that we get to perfect this side of the grave. What a strange choice for a leader, though. This one who is not an influencer of anyone, really. This one whose skills are fishing. This one who will misunderstand, try to make it about something different, get scared over and over again in this school with Jesus, where they're sort of apprenticing alongside him for those years, learning what they will need to know and how they are to live and who they are to be. Jesus will offer him abundance and catch him when he begins to fall, and challenge him when he stands in the way, and wash his feet and predict his betrayal and love him over and over again. Jesus sought Peter out and continued to love him and continued to teach him. Note a couple of things. God calls all people to this adventurous work that is God's bringing about the realm of God to this place. Even fishers from some small town that no one cares about, that aren't super faithful. They aren't super smart, and they aren't super pious. He takes them as they are because he knows that every single one of them has sacred worth and something to offer this grand design. But they don't stay the way they start. Jesus will help and teach and love, but sometimes that looks like a pretty strong challenge. Jesus accepts Peter for who he is and knows his sacred worth that he has, but also will guide him from being rocky to becoming the rock. And that's good news for us who also have wandering hearts. Here we learn that Jesus seeks us too and finds us in times when we are afraid, times when we're strong, times when we don't know anything about what we have to offer. How many times have you thought that in the last 2 months? Times when we're sure. Times when we'd rather stay quiet and complacent than proclaim the God that we know and love. Times when we're ready to announce it. I thought of a fun story last night that I've maybe told once or twice that you may have heard, but there was a time when I took a group of college students to St. Charles, Louisiana. We were going on a Habitat for Humanity trip. And the students halfway through the week had a conversation with someone who invited them to a revival at their church. And they promised to make gumbo for everybody in our group. And so when this one group came back from our work sites, they were trying to convince me as their leader to take them to this revival. Come on, Holly, it's a cultural experience. We have to go. Well, a couple things. It is a Lutheran college, but not everybody who goes to that college is Lutheran. And so I had 20 people on that trip, most of whom I did not know very well, and who came from various faith backgrounds. And cultural experiences are a big deal in that college and in the college world. So it's pretty hard to say no when they tell you it's a cultural experience. And so we went to this rural place out in Louisiana, and there were no snakes, but everything else happened. When we got there, there was someone praying the space in tongues, and so that was a cultural experience for us. That's good. But Brother Bart was the person who was speaking that day, and Brother Bart hit every single hot button issue. This was like 2007, I suppose. He talked about, oh God, it was 3 hours. There was a flute player who played through all this business, but Brother Bart talked about how you're going to hell if you commit suicide. He talked about how you're going to, he needed money for a new printer so he could send out newsletters for people who were considering abortion. He said there was a time when he was gay, but he prayed and it made him straight. And now he has a fine wife. Look at, honey, you know you're fine. You know you're the finest woman in this room. I am not lying to you. This all happened. And I'm sitting there with these college students, having no idea what most of them are experiencing as they sit through this, except that there is at least one who is crying and shaking. And we get into the vans 3 hours later. And some had gone up. Oh, I missed one of my best parts here. Some had gone up to be prayed over. I was also asked to stand up, and he wanted to pray for me as the leader of this group. We were, by the way, about a third of the crowd there. So it was obvious that there were guests in the space, and it was us. And he notices that I don't have a wedding ring on. So he decides his prayer is for me, for Jesus to be my husband. Which I was like, how's Jesus on the barbecue? Because, I mean, I guess we have a story about the fish on the beach, so maybe he's okay, but I have a few expectations. I mean, I'm pretty good on a grill too, so that's why we're all fine now. But we were up till 3 a.m. that night processing this whole experience. One of those girls had lost 2 brothers to suicide, and so what was happening in her was she knew that the words that were hitting her were absolutely antithetical to everything that she knew about God. And that was sort of we just processed everything that we were hearing and tried to figure out how to hold the complexity of the things that felt okay and the things that felt wrong. And there's so many complexities, it's just hard to even remember it all, which is part of why we wanted to talk about it. But the part of the story that I want to tell the most is that the next morning I had a bunk that was sharing a wall with the kitchen, and Tyler and Josh were up making pancakes. And what I woke up to was Tyler, who's pretty loud, saying, "I don't know a God who's not a God of love. That's not the God that I know." And so I giggled when I woke up that morning, even though I had only had 3 hours of sleep. Times like that, times when we find our voice and announce, "This is not God. This is the God that I know." With all kinds of loud voices in this world saying really false things about who God is right now, it will be important for us to start finding our voice and saying who we know God to be, the God of grace and love. Because each of us in this room also have sacred worth, and God chooses to work through us, even with all of the times when we seem unsteady or rocky or unwilling to use that voice. We are in the process of becoming, and all along the rocky way, we stumble into God's call for our lives and stand up and name the God that we know, the truth and the gospel, the love and grace we have received that is available to all. And all means all. And we learn to live into those callings throughout our whole lives. So we join Peter in figuring out faith and finding our way. Wandering hearts, all of us.